Well, good evening, everyone. It is great to be here and great to welcome everybody in the room and everybody who is watching from home as well. Sorry that this is delayed for a week. We were definitely not ready. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I'm just about ready now. So it is good to be here and to be doing this. And can I just say I really enjoyed the last time. I hope it was beneficial to everybody else. I think we might do something more like this again in the future. Maybe we'll not put two of them so close together because it is a bit of a panic. But I've really got a lot out of these myself. And just to notify on something, on August the 6th, August the 6th, August the 7th, whichever's the Tuesday, we'll be having a special night where we're going to be talking about the rapture, and we will be having a debate, the rapture debate between Pastor Cliff and David Taylor, and I will be adjudicating. And that's going to be a fun night, and I think it's going to be a really helpful night, where we're going to really look at both arguments in full. The verses used, we'll present both arguments, we'll rebut both arguments, and I just hope, because sometimes you hear both but you never really hear the detail, so I'm hoping that'll be a really helpful night. So looking forward to that in a few weeks' time.
I'm going to finish with a vote.
Sorry?
We'll have a vote at the end.
Oh, I don't know if we'll have a vote at the end. Maybe we will. I don't know whether we should declare a winner, because if we're wrong...
Everyone will have to be fully persuaded.
I do apologise, you were correct,
it is the 6th. Oh, phew, I put the right date on the promo stuff. Wonderful. Right, before we start, I just want to show you a picture. This is Paris in two different periods of time, 1900 and 2017. I saw this on Facebook today. Now, what's your initial thoughts when you look at that picture?
How much more built up it is.
In 1900. You say it was nice then. It's boring now.
It's historic.
It's more historic then, yeah. And
Water was blue then. It was green in 1900s.
oh, that might be just a colorized picture. What's interesting about this is I saw this on Facebook. There's so many people who were so angry. I can't believe what we've done to the culture there. Tore it down. We've built all of these glass buildings, concrete. Look at how beautiful those buildings are. I bet there was no good reason for turning them down. Now, interestingly, those buildings were part of the World Fair. They were temporary buildings that were never meant or built to last. They were up for a year or so to celebrate an event. They were taken down right after. And the only building that remains that was put up for that World Fair is, of course, the Eiffel Tower. So all of those were always intended to be temporary buildings. They weren't used for anything other than the World's Fair. They weren't lived in. They weren't office spaces. They weren't palaces. None of that. The reason I'm pointing this out is it shows how important it is when we're studying history to get a bit of context, because we can very easily jump to the wrong conclusions. We can very easily see something that is a historically accurate picture, but still get the wrong idea. And archaeology is one of those things where it's very easy to do that, because all we get is a picture. When we dig into archaeology, and we're using that right early on, what we need is something to guide us. That's why the Bible is a tremendous resource when we're looking at these early times, because the Bible can give us context for what it is we see. So I just want to highlight that at the start, is whenever we're doing this, we need to be very careful we don't do what everybody on Facebook did and immediately jump to the wrong conclusion. And it just goes to show, when we're reading the Bible, having historical context to go with it is a helpful thing to have. That we read the Bible knowing what was going on in the world at the time, knowing what was going on in Israel at the time. And I just want to encourage you to do that, is that, hey, sometimes we've been watching The Chosen again recently, and a lot of The Chosen stuff isn't in Scripture, but a lot of that is history and things that were happening at the time. And I think it's very important to get a broader picture when we are reading the Bible, because it does actually help us understand what we're reading. So I just wanted to start with that picture. I just saw that before I came out and thought, makes a good point, that. I'm going to go first. I'm going to be sharing tonight about Nazareth. Pastor Cliff is going to be sharing about... Microphone. Oh, switch the bottom on, yeah.
Mount Sinai.
Alan, what you will be sharing on?
I'm going to be speaking about King David.
King David.
King David was for real. It's my title.
Excellent. And David?
I'm going to be looking at a character who was in the new kingdom in Egypt, and we might find a surprise at the end of it.
Okay, wonderful. It's going to be picking up from where we were last time. One thing as well, just if you guys want to feel like you can jump in at any time, obviously you have to pick your microphones up first, but feel that we can do a little bit of back and forth on this. Otherwise we might have all been standing here separately. I'm going to start with Nazareth. There was a question in the days of Jesus. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? They assumed that the Messiah would never come out of a place like this, a small town in the far north of the country. And of course, here in Billingham, I think we always feel a little bit like we identify with Nazareth. Small town in the north of the country that people go, can anything good come out of Billingham? Having said that, cynics today would ask a different question. Did Nazareth even exist at the time of Jesus? Or was it made up? Now today, obviously, we can go to a place called Nazareth in Israel. It's there. I've been there. We know that's there. But was it there at the time of Jesus? Now, this might be a question you've never asked yourself, but it is an accusation that is made by atheists that Nazareth is made up. In fact, I'll say this. On our last night that we did this, one of the comments on the video was, we know Nazareth didn't exist, we know it's all made up. Well, we don't know that. And tonight I'll say why we don't know that. In fact, some people have made that claim that we believe that we know there was no such place as Nazareth. Those who think Jesus the person never existed will commonly argue that Nazareth is a made-up place. And the logic of that argument appears to be that if we made up Jesus' hometown, then we made up Jesus as well. Now here's the problem is, does it matter where Jesus came from? It doesn't really. It doesn't change anything. But if Nazareth was found not to exist, it would cast doubt on the reality of Scripture. One of the most recent critics of the existence of Nazareth is a guy called René Salm, who devoted an entire book to the question. The book is called The Myth of Nazareth, and he brought out this book in 2008. Salm emphasizes something that we've known anyway for a very long time. Nazareth is never mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. It's never mentioned in the writings of Josephus. It's never mentioned in the Talmud. First time we can read about Nazareth is in the Gospels. He takes that to mean it didn't exist.
Was there a census?
There was a census, yes. That is true. Everybody travelled back to their hometown for that. He basically argues that there was a Nazareth in ancient times. It ceased to exist at the time of Jesus, and then existed again in between the two Jewish revolts between 70 and 132 AD. So he basically says Nazareth didn't exist at the time of Jesus. Now, this guy, Sam, is not an archaeologist. He is not trained in archaeology. He gives no indication that he's ever been on an archaeological dig, and he has never been to Nazareth. But he has wrote a book. He bases almost his entire case on the archaeological reports about the town of Nazareth. In particular, there's some rock-cut tombs that were uncovered. These are called core tombs, and we have a picture of one of those. These were not in use in Galilee in the middle of the 1st century. So these do not date from the time of Jesus in Galilee. So he assumes because they have been found in Nazareth, or the site of Nazareth, that because they are there, they must have been built later, and therefore Nazareth didn't exist. Now his claims have huge amounts of problems with them, you'll be surprised to hear. To start with, it is hard to understand why tombs in Nazareth that can be dated after Jesus say that there was no town at the time of Jesus. The argument doesn't make any sense at all. That is to say, just because somebody lived there earlier, how does that show that the town wasn't inhabited later? What's more, he fails to stress one of the most important things about these tombs. If we put that picture of that tomb just back up for a moment, these tombs were expensive. These tombs were the ones wealthy families had. We know Jesus was laid in a tomb similar to this, and it was the tomb of a wealthy man. So these would not have been in Nazareth at the time of Jesus, because there's nothing in any record to suggest that Nazareth had any wealthy families at the time of Jesus. So what does the fact that these tombs were found after Jesus, what does that tell us? Nothing. Nothing at all. Other than, after the time of Jesus, there was some wealthy people in the area. That's it. The tombs that poor people used in Israel at the time, when Jesus would have been there, were shallow graves, and those were poor people graves who never survive for archaeology. That's the pauper's grave, if you want a better term. So has any evidence of people living in Nazareth at the time of Jesus actually been found? I wonder, could we find the hometown of Jesus? Or could we even find the home of Jesus? Now that's difficult, because what chances are there that a small, simple, out-of-the-way, unimportant house would survive for 2,000 years? Why should any place survive for 2,000 years? That's not important. I don't think my house is going to be around in 2,000 years' time. And what does that really mean? I mean, who can find the childhood home of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle? Nobody knows where they grew up. So what does it matter? But I'm saying this because we need to be very careful about what we can expect from archaeology. Archaeology can show us what was there. It can't tell us the whole story of what happened. But in Nazareth, there have been some remarkable finds. In 1313 AD, Constantine, through the Edict of Milan, said that the Christian religion should be tolerated throughout the Roman Empire. I know you're going to bring up a little bit on Constantine yourself, Cliff. He sent his mother, Helena Augusta, gave her unlimited funds to travel through the Holy Land and find Christian relics and Christian sites. Now, since this was only 230 years after the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome, she was able to find some stuff. Having said that, her results were varied, to say the least, and she was led on to some places that we would certainly dispute as the real place. But some of them were quite easy. I mean, for example, the place where Jesus was supposed to have been born in Bethlehem was known by Christians who'd worshipped there for decades. But then in 135 AD, before this happened, the Roman Emperor Hadrian wiped away anything from that site and built a temple to Adonis on top of it. But by the time Helena came there, it was still recognized as the birthplace of Jesus. So she tore the temple down and put a church on it. 200 years later, that church was torn down in the Samaritan revolt. But not long after that, the Byzantine? Thank you. I'm going to try not to say that word again. The Emperor Justinian had it rebuilt again. And so it went out the centuries. Up and down and up and down. Destroyed, built, destroyed and built. So much so that we know exactly that it's the same location that they destroyed and built back then, because once somebody knocked it down, somebody else built it back up. So that's easy to find. Nazareth was not somewhere travellers really went to. It was a few hundred miles north of Jerusalem, and Helena never made it anywhere near there. So that's one of the main reasons the early church didn't venerate the site. But there are compelling pieces of archaeological evidence that Nazareth did exist in Jesus' day, and that, like other villages and towns in that part of Galilee, it was built into the hillside. One thing they did was they excavated a farm connected with the village, and it dates to the time of Jesus. We have an image of what would have been the uncovered irrigation system that the farm would have used. So this is a man-made irrigation system that proves that there was a farm in this area. There's also been found a wine press that was built into the bedrock. Now I know that doesn't look like a wine press, but hey, I'm not an archaeologist. The archaeologist said it is. It was built into the bedrock, and this has been dated to the time of Jesus. And we've been there. We've actually been to that wine press. And there is also a mikveh bath that has been found, again, that goes back to that time, that says that the people who lived here had a strong Jewish background. So we have Jewish people who press grapes and take mikveh baths in the area of Nazareth. Mikveh bath, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know, was the what you did to purify yourself if you were unclean. Psalm disputes the finding of the archaeologist who did the excavation. Now it needs to be remembered he's not an archaeologist. He's basing his views on what the archaeologist said. All of the archaeologists that he's getting his evidence from disagree with what he says. For one thing, there was an archaeologist called Yardena Alexandre, and she found 165 coins in this excavation, and she specified in the report some of them were from the 14th or 15th century. So Psalm goes, they're from the 14th, 15th century. They can't be from the time of Jesus, obviously. And he says, so therefore, these are all, everything you find near this is dated later. However, she also found coins in exactly the same place that were Hellenistic, early Roman, and from the days of Jesus. But that doesn't fit with his argument, so he ignores them. As it turns out, another discovery was made in Nazareth a year after his book came out. His book came out in 2008, this was 2009. And it's a house that dates to the time of Jesus. This was uncovered in 2009. Again, the archaeologist was Yardana Alexandria. I hope I've pronounced the name right. She is the director of excavation at the Israel Antiquity Authority. They found pottery on this house that again ranges from a roughly 100 BC to 100 AD. 100 BC to 100 AD. So right around the time of Jesus is when that pottery dates. Now there's nothing in the house to suggest that the people had any wealth. There's no glass, there's no imported objects, but it is solid evidence that at the time of Jesus, people lived here in Nazareth. But why is it not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, or Josephus, or the Talmud? It's because it was small, poor, and insignificant. It's like saying, why is Port Clarence never mentioned in Parliament? No, but you know what I mean? And I don't mean that as a diss on Port Clarence. Even though it existed, it was not the place someone would make up as the hometown of their Messiah. Now, up until very recently, very little archaeological work had actually ever been done in Nazareth. However, there was a site within a place called the Sisters of Nazareth Convent, which is just across the road from the Church of the Annunciation, which we've been to that church, haven't we? And this contains some of the best evidence that a small town existed in the time of Jesus. And we've known about this since the 1880s. But it was never properly published. It was never studied by professional archaeologists until 2006. And more than just finding the town that Jesus existed in, maybe, just maybe, and I'm saying maybe, there's something even more exciting in this site. It may be possible that this is the childhood home underneath this church of Jesus. In 1881, they moved there to build a convent. Not long after this started, they discovered an ancient cistern. Along with the workmen that they employed and some children from the school that they ran, never get away with that nowadays, they began to excavate the area. And they exposed this complex sequence of preserved archaeological features. There was Crusader period walls, Crusader vaults, a Byzantine, a Byzantine cave church, Roman period tombs, and other rock-cut built structures. The large church that the nuns discovered seems to have been the long-lost Church of the Nutrition, supposedly the site that Jesus' home was in Nazareth. That church was destroyed in 721 by Caliph Yadiz II, and nobody knew where it was. And the sisters accidentally found it. But neither they or anyone else had any idea of what it could possibly be. So from 1880s all the way to 2006, nobody had really dug any further. And then in 2006, a full investigation began on this site under the supervision of a guy called Ken Dark, who is from Reading University in England. And it was at this point that it was found that there was a lengthy chronological sequence of well-preserved structures, and the features began to reveal themselves. This included Crusader and Byzantine churches, 2 early Roman period tombs, a phase of small-scale quarrying, and then underneath all of that, the greatest significance of all was this other structure is a partly cut, with a rock house that is built out of cut rock and partially stone-built stone walls. And I think we have a picture of that house there. That's it. This is a 1st century courtyard house that is hewn from the natural rock and constructed within rock-built walls. And many of the home's original features are still intact, including the door, as you see there, and windows. Now, we know this structure is dated to the early Roman period because it's confirmed by the Kafar Hanaya type pottery, as we see one of the pots that were found there. This was pottery from the time of Jesus that was found in this house. Probable fragments of limestone vessels were also found, which indicates that the inhabitants were very likely to be Jewish, because limestone vessels aren't subject to the impurity laws, and therefore they were very popular amongst Jewish communities. The structure of this house has a series of rooms. One with its doorway survived at full height. Another had a stairway rising to another wall. A rock overhang had carefully been retained in one room, and its upper surface showed that it had an upper story, which may have been built of another material, probably timber. And then just inside the surviving doorway, they found the original chalk floor. This, along with the pottery that was found, suggests that this was a domestic habitation. This was where somebody lived. Taken together, the walls is the so-called courtyard house, one of the typical architectural forms of early Roman period in Galilee. So this is a house from the time of Jesus, remarkably preserved because people kept building churches over the top of it. Then somebody would knock the church down and they built another church on top of it. Since very early history, this place has been protected within cellars of the Byzantine and Crusader churches. And it's been protected for that long. So just maybe, and I'm saying just maybe, this could be what was at least seen as by the early church as the home of Jesus as he was a child. Now, the fact that tombs have been found also in this place was initially puzzling to them. But domestic, because you weren't allowed to live anywhere near a tomb. You weren't allowed to build a house on somewhere that had been a tomb. But the burials are separated in history from that domestic occupation by a time of quarrying, by a time of years, and then the house was already in disuse before the site was used for tombs. You weren't allowed to build houses where there was tombs, but where there used to be a house, you were allowed to build a tomb. So that's actually, the conflict is an illusion. There's no conflict. This house dates from the 1st century AD or earlier. And no pottery was found in that house any earlier or any later than the early Roman period. So even if it isn't the house Jesus grew up in, it is the style of house that Nazareth would have had when Jesus grew up. There was another nearby town called Sepphoris, which was actually a huge contrast to Nazareth, and that's been found. It was a very Roman town. And it's thought that Sepphoris would have actually provided Joseph with work, because there was all kinds of stuff going on there, especially with the fact that they'd accepted Roman culture quite a lot. And he believes Nazareth was kind of the counter to Sepphoris, that you have a very Roman-influenced town, you then get at the other side of the valley a very Jewish traditional town, and that Jesus would have grown up in a town that was extremely Jewish, extremely traditional, but he was also exposed to the Roman culture as well. Nowhere else in the Roman Empire is such a seemingly clear-cut boundary between people accepting and rejecting Roman rule. And that's where Jesus would have grown up, in that atmosphere. So just to conclude, to those who say, we know Nazareth didn't exist at the time of Jesus, and there's no references to Nazareth in the 1st century. There are references to Nazareth in the 1st century. They're called the Gospel. There are references to Nazareth in the 2nd century. There are references to Nazareth in the 3rd century. Just because there was nothing before the Gospels doesn't mean anything other than Nazareth was a place, was not important at all. Just the sort of place where you would say, could anything good come out of Nazareth? But there is evidence that Nazareth as a place existed at the time of Jesus. Whether that's the house or not that Jesus grew up in, it is impossible to say on any archaeological grounds. On the other hand, there's no good archaeological reason why it should also be discounted. What we can say is that building is where the Byzantine church builders believed that Jesus had spent his childhood. So that's Nazareth. And I was excited coming across some of those. Finding such a preserved house, I think, is truly remarkable. Because and bear in mind, that's been found since that book was written. But I'm willing to guess the guy hasn't refuted a thing he said. So, Cliff.
When you mentioned that there's some people say that there was no such place as Nazareth,
Yeah.
there was a prophecy, wasn't there, that he shall be called a Nazarene.
Now, Nazarene doesn't
Is that
necessarily mean
from
Nazareth.
Nazareth?
That's the Nazarite vow.
All right.
The Nazarite vow was the what Samson took.
Yeah.
Oh, why have
So
I
it's
forgotten
not
his name?
referring to Nazareth itself.
Prophet Samuel. Samuel was a Nazarite. So it's not from Nazareth. A Nazarene is someone who'd made a commitment to God from childhood. Yes.
Just as a matter of interest, the place 3 miles away from Nazareth, which was Sepphoris. Sepphoris was an armoury for the Jewish nation. This is before the Romans, but there was also part of the treasury building there as well. And when, just at the time of the birth of Jesus, there was a big revolt when Herod died, and Judas the Galilean started the revolt, and his base was in Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was completely destroyed, completely. And when the Romans came in 6 years later, they wanted to use it as a base. So it became one of the biggest building projects in Galilee. So Joseph, as a builder, the word for builder in the Greek is tekton, which means more general building than just carpentry. And Jesus himself most likely worked in Sepphoris, because it was a short walk away from where Jesus lived.
It's remarkable to think, isn't it? That just that short, but it shows Jesus growing up in a protected Jewish environment, which of course Israel itself was the only place he could grow up. And he grew up in such a set of circumstances that was just at the exact time. But then also to have that other influence to understand the Gentile world as well. I think it's like, I mean, it isn't like, everything was designed ahead of time to be the exact right environment for Jesus to grow up in. And I think that's amazing.
When you mentioned about the wine press that had been found, I can remember when we were there, I can remember when we were at that wine press, we were told that Nazareth would be just a small village with not many inhabitants. And that wine press was big. And what they said was all the village would come to that wine press to press the grapes. And it would be a festive thing, that they would all come and work together. And he said that there was every possibility that Jesus would have pressed grapes at that place, grown up as a boy. Yeah.
It's remarkable. And the sad thing is when you go to Nazareth, I mean, these digs have uncovered loads. When you visit a place and you find that there's just a church there, and you can't see anything about what it's like, which is why I find the digs so interesting, because then you get a proper picture of what it's like, instead of just a big, admittedly impressive building that doesn't give you any real feeling of what it was like then. And but seeing things like the wine press, you get that little flavour of what was actually there at the time. It's fascinating.
Did they have any indication of how big it was? How many houses would have been there?
It seems to have been very small, although Ken Dark, who's doing the archaeological work there at the moment, has revised that to say it mightn't have been as small as we think, but it was definitely insignificant. Now, how small is small? Because, I mean, you look at the size of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, we'd call that small now, so, and that was the big city. So it's hard to know how you would define small back then. Maybe Port Clarence. But I mean, have you ever driven through Port Clarence? It is not a big place. It is not a big place. But it's a community that exists. And again, I don't mean to disparage Port Clarence, but it's a small community of people, and I don't get the feeling size-wise it would have been too much different. Okay, that's Nazareth. We are now going to move over to Mount Sinai. I can't see anything tonight.
The last time we did this, remember I talked about the Pool of Siloam, which is one of the latest archaeological finds in Israel. Experts believe that they've found one of the most holy sites in miles away from where it has been presumed to be for centuries. And that place is Mount Sinai. I thought it would be good tonight if we could just have a look at what happened at Mount Sinai. Remember when Moses fled from Egypt? He went and found Jethro's daughters, married Jethro's daughters, and dwelt for 40 years in Midian. And there was that day that he was tending sheep at the backside of the desert. After 40 years being in that, somebody said he was 40 years being brought up, getting to know everything. And he spent 40 years getting out of him everything that he'd known. 40 years he was a somebody, and for 40 years he was a nobody. Nobody knew about him. Well, obviously, when he was in Egypt, everybody knew about him. He was the Prince of Egypt. So he's at the backside of the desert tending Jethro's sheep, and he sees this bush. In fact, the Bible, let's just read a verse from the Bible. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert, and he came to Horeb, which is another name for Sinai, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. We know that God called him that day to go back into Egypt and gave him the commission to let my people go. And it was at this place that we're looking at tonight where God met him at the burning bush. And it tells us in verse 12, God said this to him, I will certainly be with you. This shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So here God's saying you will return here when you brought the people out of Egypt. And
Isn't it fascinating? I turned it off twice. It's fascinating that God says this will be the sign to you. So Moses goes. Moses doesn't get the sign until after the job is done. Sometimes we want the sign first, don't we?
Yeah.
God, I'll go, give me a sign. God says to Moses, go, then you'll get the sign. I just think there's a lesson there for us all.
So Moses brings the children of Israel out of Egypt. They have this journey through the Red Sea. They believe that they've found where that crossing took place. It's now called New Bay Beach, and it's 10 miles from the Egyptian side over to the opposite side, over what is now the Gulf of Aqaba. And we're not talking about that tonight, but they believe that they've found the only place it could be, because remember when they came to the Red Sea, they were hemmed in on either side by mountains, and the Egyptians were behind them. There was no escape. And there's only one place where that could be located. And they found under the water there, they found an underwater path that would be easy for the children of Israel to walk over. Remember, we're talking about 2.5 to 3 million people who were liberated from Egypt. And so they come from the Red Sea, they make their way into the wilderness, and the journey begins. And as God said, they come back to this mountain of God, to Sinai. And we know the story that Moses, well, what happened at Sinai, there are many things that happened. I just wanted us to look at a few of them tonight. Jethro, his father-in-law, he came, when they got to Sinai, Jethro, his father-in-law, brought Moses' wife and his 2 sons to him. Remember, that was the time he said, you're going to wear yourself out, looking after all these people. Why don't you appoint people to take some of the burden off your shoulders? And but it was his wife and his 2 sons who came to him, because he'd sent them back when he went into Egypt. He'd sent them back home, but Jethro brings them. And so Moses is then called up to the mount. God speaks to him and calls him up to the mount, and we know that God gave him commandments, the 10 commandments, and he also gave him many other commandments, how Israel should live. And the Bible tells us that the whole mountain, the glory of the Lord, rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for six days. And Moses went up there, and I didn't realize that he didn't go up alone. Well, he did this time. I'm telling a lie. There are several times he went up the mountain. We think sometimes he went up just to get the commandments. He didn't. He went up there several times, according to what the Bible tells us. And God called him up to Sinai. And then he told him to go down and tell the people, don't come near this mountain. For 6 days, the Bible says that the cloud, the glory of God covered it for 6 days. And God said, don't let the people come near this mountain. They had to put boundaries around the mountain. And they couldn't come anywhere near it. And then, after Moses had told the people not to come near the mountain, he went back up the mountain. And this time, he took Joshua, and he took 70 elders of the Israelites with him, and Nadab and Abihu. He took them with him up to the top of the mountain. They didn't get to the top because when they were so far up, there was a plateau that they were on, and the Bible tells us that God appeared to him. I don't know if I can find the scripture. Exodus 24. Then the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and be there, and I will give you tablets of stone and the law and the commandments which I have written, that you may teach them. So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. And he said to the elders, wait here until we come back to you. Indeed, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man has a difficulty, let him go to them. Then Moses went up into the mountain, and a cloud covered the mountain. And the glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day he called Moses out of the midst of the cloud. The sight of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. So Moses went into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So during that time, God speaks to him. He gives him the commandments. We were just saying today, weren't we? What were the commandments? You know, he gave tablets of stone. That's what the Bible says.
We have this picture, don't we, of
Yeah.
Moses holding these massive stones like that, usually. But we were saying, there's no way. I mean, he's 80. I'm 40. Yeah, that's go do that again. We're talking that size.
If you remember the stones that were used in correspondence last time.
Microphone.
I thought my mug was the microphone. If you remember last time we looked at correspondence that was sent to the Egyptians at that time.
Cuneiform.
And the cuneiform tablets, and the cylinder was only like that. Yeah.
You could write a lot in a small space.
Correct.
So, I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried picking up a paving slab. I don't like the odds of an 80-year-old carrying 2 of them down a mountain.
No. But Moses didn't just get the 10 commandments when he was up there. God gave him other commandments how the children of Israel should live. And he also gave him instructions about the tabernacle. And he was up there for 40 days. And it says when he had made an end of speaking with him on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. So he's up there for 40 days, nearly 6 weeks, 7 weeks. He's up on the mountain. And the people down below are getting a bit agitated. Where's Moses? He's delayed. And then the golden calf. Can you remember the golden calf? They said, we don't know what's happened to Moses. Let's make a god for ourselves that we might worship him. And Aaron gave in to the what they were saying, and they made this golden calf. They took their gold earrings out, and out of that they carved this golden calf. And Moses comes down the mountain with Joshua. He'd obviously left Joshua's somewhere there. And when they come down from the mountain, they hear the sound of dancing. In fact, Joshua said it's the sound of, what did he say? Joshua said it's like the sound of war that I hear, noise of war. There's a big commotion going on, and Moses said it's not. It's the sound of singing, it's the sound of dancing. And of course, when they came down, here they were worshipping this golden calf. Now, the Egyptians had served the goddess of love, which was Hathor, which was like a sexy cow. That's a sexy cow.
I can't picture what that is.
Let your imaginations run wild.
Don't.
When they came down from the mountain, Moses saw them, what they were doing. He saw men, doing provocative things. And so Moses is angry. God says, I'm going to destroy them for what they've done. Moses pleads with God. And God relents from the harm which he said that he was going to do to the children of Israel. And so now Moses returns back up the mountain with another 2 tablets, because he was so angry when he saw what was going on. He smashed the 2 tablets of stone. And God said, get another 2 tablets and come to the mountain. And when Joshua went back up the mountain, when Moses went back up the mountain, he received again the commandments that God gave him. Remember, those commandments, those tablets of stone, were placed in the Ark of the Covenant, which is another thing. But Moses burned the golden calf in the fire. But the Bible says he burned it with fire, he ground it to powder, and he scattered it on water, and he made the children of Israel drink it. And that day, 3,000 men, the Levites, put the swords on, and 3,000 men who'd been involved in this orgy that was going on, they died. They were killed by the sword. Those who escaped thought they might have escaped. They didn't, because God sent a plague on the rest of them, and they died. And God said, I'm not going to go with you. You can go into Canaan, you can go on this journey on your own. Moses pleaded with God. He said, if you don't go with us, we don't want to go. And with these 2 new tablets of stone that were being cut, Moses goes up to the top of the mountain. There he meets with God again, and he's there for another 40 days and 40 nights. And the Bible tells us that the whole of the mountain, the top of it, was ablaze with the glory of God, lightning, thunder. They heard the voice of God speaking from the mountain. It must have been absolutely awesome. All the children of Israel heard it. And when he comes back down the mountain, He's been there 40 days and 40 nights in the presence of God. His face is shining. And he has to put a veil over his face. So this place, Mount Sinai, it must have been an awesome place. The mountain of God. A place where God himself ascended, descended, met with Moses and Joshua and 70 of the elders. And they saw the glory of God. And it must have been an awesome place to be. One of the main reasons that scholars claim that the Exodus is a myth, it's because little's been found of the traditional Mount Sinai. You mentioned Constantine and
Yeah, Helena.
Helena, his mother. She had put places all over Israel where different things had happened. And she'd placed Mount Sinai in Egypt, on the Sinai Peninsula. And for centuries, this has been the place that pilgrims have gone to in their thousands.
There's a monastery there. We have a picture of
St.
it.
Catherine's Monastery. That's the one that they've been going to for years and years and years as Mount Sinai. And yet, in Galatians chapter 4, verse 45, in the New Testament, Paul taught, let's just read that verse here. Paul definitely states that Sinai is not in Egypt, but in Saudi Arabia. Arabia.
There was no Saudi Arabia then.
No, there wasn't. Can anybody tell me what page Galatians is on?
How come you can't just press up Galatians?
Can't find it. It's not in my Bible. Can somebody find it for me? Oh, I've got it here. Here we go. Galatians 4, verse 45. That's not right either. Oh yeah, it's 4 verse 25. I've got the wrong verse down. Which things are symbolic? For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. So people have been going to Mount Sinai in Egypt, and maybe they've been going to the wrong place. In the 1980s, a Christian adventurist called Ron Wyatt, he claimed to have found the real Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia, in the Tabuk province, near the country's southwest border that abuts the Gulf of Aqaba. And because Wyatt was not an archaeologist, and he was known to claim melodramatic finds at biblical sites, his assertion was intriguing, but not given a lot of credence by credentialed professionals. In fact, a lot of what Ron Wyatt said was
Nonsense.
He was a con man.
Yeah, he was nonsense. The site was also fenced off. When Wyatt was there, he was put in prison for 72 days. He was arrested while he was there. The site was fenced off by Saudi officials. It wasn't a place open for exploration. Regardless, a few years later, two more Christian explorers, Robert Connock and Larry Williams, snuck into the area, filmed what they saw, and they released it to the public. And I would encourage you to have a look at this it's absolutely fascinating. If you search on YouTube and Google the search for the real Mount Sinai, there are several videos on there that are absolutely excellent. And they released this documentary. It's on YouTube today, The Search for the Real Mount Sinai. And so people had been going to this place in Egypt called Mount Sinai. And if I'd been taking a tour in the 80s and the 90s, I would have gone there, because that was the traditional site. But now in the 80s and in the 90s, the early 90s, this other site comes up, which is not in Egypt, but in Arabia, which is now Saudi Arabia. And this, can we put the next slide on?
Yep, this is the image of Mount Horeb.
In Saudi Arabia, Jabal al, that's the name of the mountain range.
Yeah, the Mountain of Almonds.
The Mountain of Almonds, but the mountain itself, which they believe is Mount Sinai, is called Jabal Magla. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Now, if you noticed on the top, there's a blackened peak. It's the only blackened peak in that range. It looks as though it's either been scorched by the sun
It's a volcano.
or fire, or it's a volcano.
It is a volcano. You only get volcanic mountains east side of the Rift Valley, and that's
Well, the volcanic mountains are about 100 miles away from there.
that's volcano.
Yeah. If it was volcanic,
We do have some pictures of the blackened rocks there.
yeah, if it was volcanic, there's some of the rocks on the top.
And then the next one.
Then lava runs down a mountain. That is just on the top of a mountain.
Not all volcanoes spew lava, though.
Mm.
Just be aware.
Mm.
I'm sorry, I'm not being...
Yeah, yeah. So,
What's interesting about those stones is, in particular, do you want to
Yeah.
mention those?
if you can see the stones, they're black on the top, but when they cut them, or when they're broken, they're not underneath. The black is just on the top. The scorch is just on the top and not right through. Which if it had been volcanic, then it would have been right through. If I can show you another photograph there.
Is that the plane?
Next one.
Or the next? That one?
Yeah. In the Mount Sinai in Egypt, the plain, there's nothing. Remember, you've got to have somewhere where 2.5 million people can go. In Egypt, there is no evidence of anything, any people being there at all. But here we've got a massive plain near the mountain itself, where it would have been easy to house that amount of people. Although I do believe that the camp of Israel was 4 miles away from this mountain where they camped. They had to come to the mountain. God called them to the mountain. But the camp itself of Israel has been located about 4 miles away from the base of the mountain. Next photograph. This has been found at the base of the mountain. And what you can see there are carvings. What do you call them? Poly something? What do you call a carving in a rock?
I have no idea.
Polygraphics, I think. Is that right?
I don't know.
Petroglyphics, is it? Petroglyphics. And so these carvings have been found. And you remember what I said about when Moses came down from the mount? These carvings are carvings of cows with men on their backs. And what can we say?
Yeah, let's move on to the next picture.
Yeah, men on their backs, and it's obvious that they are aroused. Put it that way.
We're on to the next picture now. Yes,
Yeah.
we're definitely on to that now. Okay, we are
Yeah.
on to the.
Yeah.
We've gone to a wide shot. So that's
So
the.
The Bible says that on the top of that altar there is a place where they believe was the calf. They put the calf. So at the bottom you've got the carvings and you've got this altar where they believe the calf was. On the top of those stones there's a plinth that they believe was the place where the calf.
Now, what did
Place.
Moses do to that calf?
He destroyed it.
And
He made them drink it,
yeah,
but there's no water there. But near to this place, can you put the next
picture.
one on, please? There is a dried up stream. And where the altar was, there's flowing down the mountains. It would have been easy for the rains, which still happens today, to flow down and cause the stream. The stream came right next to this altar. But Moses built an altar there. God had commanded him to build an altar. Next photograph. And he said, God told him to build an altar, and I'll just read these verses to you. In Exodus 20. Verse 24. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings, your peace offerings, your sheep, your oxen. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you and bless you. And so God commanded him to build this altar, and they found the altar.
That's not a picture of it, though.
No,
is it?
that's not the picture of
something
the
else.
altar.
I don't have a picture of that.
He also commanded him to have 12 pillars.
That's what they are.
Yeah, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And these have been found in this location. Next photograph.
I think that's just a wide shot, isn't it?
No,
That's something else.
that there is a burial ground that's been found.
All right, okay.
The burial ground was found 4 miles away, where the camp of Israel was. And remember the people that I mentioned? 3,000 died, and then those that died by the plague. This burial ground's in the middle of nowhere. No inhabitants there, and yet there's a mass burial ground. And the archaeologists are saying that people who were buried there all together. It was a mass graveyard. And that was found 4 miles away from the location of the bottom of Sinai. And then the final thing that I want to mention is when they came out of, they came to a place called Rephidim. There was no water there. And God commanded Moses to strike the rock, and out of it gushed water. Now this place is absolutely colossal. You can't miss it. And it's interesting that God told him to go to the rock which was in Horeb. How did Moses know where this place was? I believe that this place here was a landmark. Everybody knew this rock. It stands something like 40 to 60 feet high on a plateau. So it's on a plateau, and people can't miss it. And I believe that that rock that was there then, there now, was there then, but it was there as a landmark. Moses knew where to go to when God told him to go to the rock, which was in Horeb, when they were complaining about having no water. And he strikes the rock, water gushes out.
Just to qualify that as well is, obviously, if this is the place, Moses spent time there for, 40 years.
40 years he knew where it was.
So he'd have known the landmarks.
Yeah. And what they found there, as they've excavated it, they found that water, the rocks coming down are all smooth, which indicates that water had smoothed those rocks, that gushed out. And they reckon that was the rock that Moses, and that's in this vicinity, a place called Rephidim. There it is again, just another.
Yeah. I'm going to wrap you up in one moment, but you do have one final location.
Yeah,
to mention.
it's Elam. At Elam, they found this in this locality. The Bible says they came to a place called Mara. They couldn't drink the water, it was bitter. And then they came to Elam, where there were 70 springs of water, and was it 12 wells? And they found them here. The wells are still there today at this place. It's not called Elam now. It's called by another name. But all this is in this locality. So just to wrap up then, in Saudi Arabia they still call this area Midian. And this is a compelling case that this is Mount Sinai. Everything fits the biblical narrative. And it does so with an abundance of archaeological and geographical evidence that this place is the real Mount Sinai, where all this took place, these mighty happenings.
Thank you for that, Cliff. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's one of those things that we can't say with surety, and we can't, because, like we said, with those pictures of Paris, we can get a story that fits there, and we can see how, as the narrative progresses, that the locations do fit that. But of course, we only get half the story through archaeology and through geology. But it is an interesting location and the fact that so many things line up does make it an interesting place, and makes you think of the things a little bit differently. So, thank you for that. Wonderful. And Alan, what delights do you have for us?
Right, well, my title is King David Was for Real. And the reason I say that is because every possible effort has been made by skeptics to fictionalize King David.
Because, of course, if you fictionalize King David, you fictionalize Israel as a kingdom.
That's right, you do.
And there's an agenda to do that.
Yeah, it's in the interests of some parties to do that.
Yeah, not mentioning any names.
No. So the history of the Jewish nation, Israel, ruled by David's descendants, automatically follows that it couldn't have happened. It couldn't be a historical fact. Also, the claim of the Palestinian roots, claiming the land as being theirs from way back, it becomes laughable, really. And certainly with the information I'll bring to you, I think you'll agree that Israel truly have the claim to the land. King David was for real. In 1993, archaeologists discovered the names of David and Israel in an inscription carved in stone only 100 years after David's death. And the Biblical Archaeological Review of March-April 1994, on page 26, reports it's not often that an archaeological find makes the front page of the New York Times, to say nothing of Time magazine. But that is what happened last summer, that was 1993, to a discovery at Tel Dan, a beautiful mound in northern Galilee at the foot of Mount Hermon, beside one of the headwaters of the Jordan River. A man called, well, I assume it was a man, Avraham Biran, oh yes, and his team of archaeologists, found a remarkable inscription from the 9th century BC that refers both to the house of David and to the king of Israel. This is the first time that the name David has been found in any ancient inscription outside of the Bible. That inscription refers not simply to a David, but to the house of David, the dynasty of the great Israelite king. That's surely got to silence the skeptics. Later scholars found the name House of David in the inscriptions of the famous Moabite stone dated about 100 years after David's reign. It's been observed that it's hard to understand how David's name could appear in ancient historical records if he was nothing but a legend. I don't know if King Arthur turns up in many.
No. Nowhere to
Because
be found.
he's more legend than fact.
He is absent without leave.
Absolutely. In honour of Jerusalem Day in 2007, archaeologists revealed a number of seals from the time of the biblical kings David and Solomon. The seals, along with other recently uncovered artifacts, were displayed for the first time, marking 40 years since the liberation and unification of Jerusalem by the modern state of Israel. These artifacts reveal that the city of David, ancient Jerusalem, was a commercial trading centre during David and Solomon's reign. Even having a postal system, would you believe? Probably a bit better than our current GPO, I would imagine.
No comment.
Agnostic scholars have claimed that if there was a city of David, in that time frame, it was a sleepy hollow. But how wrong they are. Actually, an elaborate city existed under King Saul before David became king. That city was a few miles southwest of Jerusalem. It was called, let's see if I can get this right, Ha-Araim, in the valley of Elah. The valley of Elah was famous for the place as being the location where David fought Goliath. Okay, and carbon-14 dating tested this place back to the 10th and 11th century BC, just prior to David becoming king, around about the time, it would seem, when David fought Goliath. The biblical name of the city being excavated, Ha-Araim, means two gates. And strangely, it actually had two gates. Since the gate was the weakest place in the defense of ancient cities, they usually only had one gate. But this city had two gates, Ha-Araim, and its Hebrew name in 1 Samuel 17:52 is called the City of Two Gates. It doesn't come across as that when you read it in our Bible, but if you were a Hebrew scholar, it would come across as that. So two gates, the actual name of the city. And this is the only city mentioned in the Old Testament with two gates. So that's an amazing archaeological find. Remember, though, the skeptics claim King David was only a myth or a small tribal chief in the 8th or 9th centuries. Well, remember, carbon-14 dated this two-gated city back to the 10th and 11th centuries BC, and it proved that the biblical lad David lived in the late 11th or 10th centuries BC. And 1 Samuel 17 tells the story of David and Goliath. The valley of Elah, the very place where David took 5 stones from the brook, and with one of them he killed, or he knocked unconscious Goliath, and then he chopped off his head with his own sword. So we read in the Bible. Then the army of the ancient Israel defeated the Philistines. And at this particular excavation, Ha-Araim, the director found ink writing on a piece of pottery. And a number of scholars, having read this writing, all agreed that it was the earliest ancient Hebrew that had been discovered. And guess what was written on it? It was a tender plea to care for slaves, widows, orphans, strangers, infants, and the poor. So the Jews, over 3,000 years ago, were endeavouring to live up to the ideals of the Torah, their book of the law, the first 5 books of the Bible. They also discovered many bones of animals in this location, but guess what? There was not a single bone found of a pig. They obviously didn't eat bacon or pork in that place. Why? Well, as Jews, they were abiding by observing the Ten Commandments. Also, they didn't believe in graven images or idols, because again, that was observed that there were no graven images in the area. So this city, Hai Araim, was constructed as a fortified city, and it was about 20 miles southwest of Jerusalem, which was a fortified city, and the fact it was about 20 miles from the capital indicated that Jerusalem was a strong municipality for the 11th century. It wasn't until 17 centuries later that Muhammad formulated the religion of Islam and united the warring tribes of Arabia. Okay, 17 centuries later. What an audacity for the Palestinians to claim their historic right to the city of Jerusalem. They've got no historical claim at all to ancient Jerusalem. So was King David a myth? Well, he's mentioned in Scripture something like 1,048 times. In the Old and New Testaments, he's the prominent figure in the genealogy of Jesus. And Jesus, of course, as David's son, will inherit the throne of his father, David. So when David captured Jerusalem, he enlarged it, surrounded it with a wall, and called it the City of David. Yet for decades, archaeologists have carried out excavations throughout the so-called City of David and elsewhere, searching in vain to prove that there was indeed a person named David. Of course, this has delighted agnostics and atheists because there's been no record found that would substantiate that. But the reason no written records were found is that the ancient Israelites wrote their records on perishable papyrus. And this contributed to the school of skeptics who, for their various reasons, refused to admit that the nation of Israel was already a thriving major state in the 10th century BC under the rule of a dynamic King David. Although in 1993 there was a startling find at the site of Tel Dan in northern Israel, an inscription was found containing the phrase, the House of David, but the skeptics attempted to undermine that as well. But I think this might be the person you mentioned, Luke, a lady called Eilat Mazur.
I think that's a different lady.
Oh, it's a different lady, is it?
Yeah.
Well, she's a biblical archaeologist, and she stated that she excavates with a Bible in one hand and a shovel in the other. Probably Mazar, to use her surname, knows the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, but better than most Christians. And she said that by searching the Bible, she knew exactly where King David's palace was located. And that had never been found in the ancient city of David. So it was, David never existed, no palace to prove it. Anyway, she said that if she got the right financial backing, she would excavate and uncover the remains of King David's palace. She observed that one of the reasons researchers were at a loss in finding King David's palace was that they assumed King David built his palace at the most protected part of the city. You would imagine that, wouldn't you, inside the city walls? However, she said that wasn't the case. The city of David, which was also impregnable, was also a very small city, approximately only 9 acres in size. Nevertheless, scholars continue to search for King David's residence within the city walls, and no remains were found that pointed to the existence of a great palace like you would expect. And this contributed to the No David school of thought. Anyway, she excavated with the Bible in one hand and a shovel in the other, and one of the main clues in finding David's palace, she said, was surprisingly from the Bible in 2 Samuel 5:17, which states that when the Philistines heard David was anointed king over Israel, they went up in full forces to search for him. But David heard about it, and the Bible says he went down from his palace to the walled city of David. And the Philistines suffered an incredible defeat that particular occasion. So the Bible indicated that the palace was located somewhere above the citadel or the walled city of ancient Jerusalem, because David went down to the stronghold. Mazur observed that the Bible would not have said went down unless David did indeed go from his palace down the slopes to the citadel. Consequently, his palace must have been located north of the city, not in the centre of it. The Philistine invasion took place after the completion of David's new palace that he'd built for himself, but before the northern fortifications were sufficiently finished. So when David, who was already living in his new palace, which wasn't yet strong enough to withstand a major assault from the north, he regrouped south of the palace in the old city when he heard they were coming to attack him. It makes common sense, doesn't it? This palace is not quite yet fully able to withstand an assault. I need to go down to the citadel. And the Philistines were defeated. And this biblical account of King David's war with the Philistines proved to Dr. Mazar that David's palace was north of the ancient walled city. So she excavated, and there stood the remains of a palace. As she viewed the complexity of this early Israelite building that marked, she exclaimed, "This can only be King David's royal palace." And she observed this area was not only available but also desirable. It was protected on the south by the citadel and the old city, on the east and west by the steep slopes of the Kidron and Tripopian valleys. Thus, archaeology proved David was not a myth in reality. King David was the greatest king in the history of Israel. And that's just about all I managed to find out about
Thank you
David.
for that. It's interesting because a lot of the skeptical view comes from this idea that after the exile, Israel elaborated its past and elaborated its history and built these myths in place. But yet, somebody finds the palace and finds it based on these records,
Yes.
which if they were elaborated, made up, you wouldn't have found it.
That's right.
So it's interesting that and there is a very common view that Israel pretty much made the history up, and a lot of it certainly exaggerated their history as a result of being in exile. But when you go through the early history of Israel and you find things like this, and that so much evidence point, and they're finding more and more about David all the time.
Yes.
There's continual archaeological digs going on there. The city of David itself is a working site still now. And you just keep finding things there. It's a fascinating place. It really is.
The steps going up to the temple.
Yeah, they've just been
from
found
the Pool of Siloam.
really recently.
Yeah,
And again, they are
from
where
the city of David.
the Psalms of Ascent, what you would have read as you went up those steps. You know, they were there. And it's fascinating. It is. Thank you, Alan. Okay, we're going over to David Taylor now. It feels too formal. We're going over to my dad now. And you're going to pick up from where you left off last time. We identified the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Are you doing a recap, or?
A very brief one.
Okay, I'll shut up.
So, yeah, I want to continue this idea that we're beginning to see clearer pictures of what's possible. And I would stress possible because obviously, as we said last week, archaeology only gives us so much. But things do emerge from secular history and from archaeology that start to paint a picture that fits in with what the Bible says. So I would never, I think it's always very difficult when you say the archaeology proves the Bible. I think that's a misleading statement, although I believe it to be true. I think what's fair to say is that the Bible account is consistent with archaeology, if that makes sense.
I'll cop on that. I picked the title. That's on me.
But it's certainly true that the more they find, they haven't found anything yet that runs against the Bible narrative. And that's incredibly important. And obviously the industry of Bible archaeology is secular. It is not a religious enterprise, although there are Christians working in the field, but by and large, even the Jewish archaeologists aren't practicing Jews in that sense, or Bible believing. Again, some are. So sometimes you've got to paint a picture, and Cliff painted a picture this evening of the possibility of that being the site of Mount Sinai, and I agree that it probably isn't at St. Catherine's Monastery. It doesn't fit. The trouble is that there's all sorts of things that don't necessarily fit the model. So what we have to be very careful as we go through, and what I do tonight, I'm going to paint you a picture as Cliff has painted a picture. And I don't want to overblow it. I don't want you to say, this is a certainty, if you're with me. What this is interesting. Is that okay? You comfortable with that? So last time we said, okay, we've got some big indicators of time. 1 Kings 6 verse 1 says, in the 4th year of King Solomon, it was the 480th anniversary of the Exodus from Egypt. Well, that's great, isn't it? You've got an actual year that you can go back and say, that's where we're looking for the Exodus. And generally, the people involved in archaeology have looked for an early date or a late date for the time of the Exodus. And we are going for an early one. Okay. So I want to try and focus on a character who's a minor character in history, although I believe incredibly important, but not a royal. And I thought what may be helpful to do is just discuss these different time periods that you get in Egyptian history. And there's a very famous one called the New Kingdom, and that's what we looked at last time. And you've got to say, well, why is it called the New Kingdom? And the reason is that something had happened in Egypt. You'd had a group of people had taken over inside Lower Egypt, so the bit near the Mediterranean coast. And if you remember from maps that we've looked at previously, Egypt, huge, long, winding country, just basically a mile or so either side of the river.
Can I just
of the Nile.
jump in for 1 second? Just when we talk about Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, sometimes we think that means Upper Egypt is north and Lower Egypt is south. That would make sense to us, wouldn't it? But that's not how it works with Egypt, is it?
No, well, it's the direction that the river travels. So the lower, the river flows to the sea, and so that's called Lower Egypt. So if you look at the bit of Egypt that's towards the Nile Delta, that is Lower Egypt. And what had happened is a group of people had taken over, and they were called Hyksos. And we know from Egyptian history that they were probably from the Canaan area. And we have pictures of them. I showed you some last time of them in stripy coats, and they've got a different hairstyle. They're like sheep, and the Egyptians said that shepherds are an abomination. They wouldn't go near a sheep. Yeah. So the question is, of course, where this Hyksos came from. And I started to give a little bit of a hint last time that maybe they were actually the children of Israel. Because they arrive, obviously, when the famine starts, and they arrive in a goodly number. If you remember, we talked about Abraham having 381 fighting men in his army, if you like. 318, thank you. You keep me right. So 318 fighting men, and obviously if you imagine 318 fighting men, you've probably got at least 318 women, and then you've probably got children on top of that, and then you've probably got other types of workers around that as well. So, you know, at the time of Abraham, he might have had 1,000 people.
It's funny, isn't it? Because you picture Abraham, you picture Isaac, you picture as a small family in a tent.
Yeah, it's not
And
like that.
It's a much bigger, bigger family than that.
It's a city that moves around. And of course, they were so big that the land wasn't able to bear the weight of him and Lot, because Lot had probably an equal size group of men as well. So if by the time of Abraham there was, let's say, 1,000 in Abraham's tribe, and that might be conservative, by the time that Isaac comes along, you'd expect it to be bigger. By the time that Jacob comes along, you would expect that to be bigger. And by the time of the 12 sons of Jacob, you would expect that to be bigger. So by the time that Joseph is in Egypt, there could be quite a significant number of people belonging to those children of Israel. When the famine comes, and they go, and you know the story of Joseph, eventually, of course, Pharaoh says, come and bring everybody, you and your servants. Bring everybody over. So imagine if you've got, I don't know, let's be, again, conservative. Let's suppose you've got 2,000 people.
So it's 370 came down.
Yeah, but that doesn't include. We'll pick that up. So no, that's cool. So the amount of people that went there, and then they're there for 400 years. How many people can grow from that number of people who, if they're especially vigorously fertile, and they live in doing a job that the Egyptians don't want to do, and then suddenly you can look, and within 4 centuries by certain, you could have ended up more or less taken over. So the question has always been, were the Hyksos an invading army that we don't know about and don't know where they came from, or were they essentially the children of Israel that had grown so large? And it's interesting because when you get into this new kingdom, it's called the new kingdom because you get a pharaoh called Kamose who goes against these Semitic people in northern Egypt. He dies in battle, and then his brother Ahmose I completes the conquest, and at that point in time, the Egyptians regain, if you like, all of the land, and they base their capital in Lower Egypt, in Memphis. The next one who's down from Kamose, his brother completes the conquest, but you get Thutmose I. And it's interesting because it talks about a pharaoh coming along who does not know Joseph. Yep. And of course, at this point in time, the children of Israel are subjugated. So the children of Israel are in captivity, which actually, if you think about it, would make sense if they were the Hyksos. You with me? Because they wouldn't have killed everybody, but they enslaved them. And that actually fits, again, the narrative that we find. So I'll go through a couple of people because they become very important. Now, Thutmose the First, have we had his picture yet? Do we have? Okay. Thutmose had a daughter, Hatshepsut. No, that's Hattie. Hatshepsut. And she was his oldest child. But he also had a son who he called, traditionally, Thutmose II. The only problem was that Thutmose II was sickly and he wasn't expected to live, and the king was on his way out. And so basically to protect him as long as possible, he had Thutmose II marry Hatshepsut. So he married his sister. And he was 2-year-old at the time. And so what happens essentially is that his sister, if you like, then gets the job as being pharaoh. You get it? You see why they might have married them? It was both to protect her position, because if he died when he was young, they didn't want any confusion over line of succession. So by marrying him, and she does, in fact, succeed. And when she succeeds, she becomes essentially a pharaoh. And it's interesting, if you look at her with a beard now, those beards are on a stick. So although it's the woman, she's got the beard on a stick that gives her the rule, if you like. She's in charge. And she becomes the pharaoh. Okay, well, that's quite interesting. Now, she rules for 22 years until the brother comes on, Thutmose III, who's only a child when she takes the throne. So the one she married dies. He's quite sickly, doesn't survive long. But there is another in the dynasty. But she becomes regent and rules. And he is Thutmose III. And so you get a picture. You've got this new kingdom. You've got a subjugated people, a defeated people, and there's no real connection between this new dynasty and the old reason why these people came to be there in the first place. Now, what I'm going to do, and I maybe leave the slides for now. I'll just tell you the story, if that's all right, and then we'll look at the slides later on and go through the slides, because they'll make a bit more sense at that point. Now, Hatshepsut was the pharaoh's daughter, but she also was a princess. She also became a pharaoh. Her reign is noted for peace and prosperity, with inscriptions highlighting her empathy towards foreigners. And there's a character who we read of in her history, and his name is Senamut, and he's a commoner, and he rises to high ranks underneath her rule. And surprisingly, he's given the most incredible range of titles. He is the royal vizier. He is the chief royal architect. And he's actually the steward to her child, Princess Neferfuri. Now, a lot of people wondered, because a commoner having become the steward for a royal, if you like, is never heard of. So a lot of people originally wondered whether or not it was her lover, and maybe it was his child. But there's no evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, it doesn't stand up to the latest discoveries. So he's non-royal in origin. He has many honours, and he rises to prominence. The name Senamut, which means mother's brother, could signify his elevated status. His parents were lowly, and they were Ramos and Hatnofa, who were described as provincial and peasants. And we read that Sennacherib began to rise under Thutmose I, and he was probably a military leader, and even went down to Ethiopia, rose through the military ranks during Thutmose's campaign in Ethiopia and in Kush, and he becomes a military leader with conquests. You'll see where I'm going in a minute. I won't keep you hanging too long. But the closeness between Sennacherib and Hatshepsut and her daughter is very well documented. I'll show you some pictures in a few minutes. And Sennacherib oversaw Hatshepsut's mortuary complex, which again I'll show you, which is an architectural marvel. And then he suddenly disappears. And when he disappears, his own tomb, which has been built, stops. Never finished. And then his name starts being hacked off.
That suggests he didn't die.
Oh no, it does suggest he doesn't die. Otherwise he would have been buried within it with high status. So what is going on? And then later on, after Amenhotep II comes to power, we find that even Queen Hatshepsut's name starts to get hacked off buildings and graffiti everywhere. So she herself loses the prestige that once she had, although she's dead at this point. But very interesting. Okay, let's maybe hit a couple of slides then, if that's the case. So, where are we next? Just where we left off, really.
We were the last one we showed was probably Hatshepsut.
Are you controlling these other desks?
No, desks.
Oh, sorry, I hadn't realised. My fault. So that is the image of Hatshepsut. It's in the Met Museum in New York. And then if we go to the next one, this is the character of Sennacherib. And it's an interesting picture. We'll come back to it at the very end. If we can go forward. There we see Sennacherib with the daughter of Hatshepsut. And he's not just a tutor. If you actually see the next one, you can see, you'll see the status that he's given. If you go to the next slide, please. And, holding the child in a very paternal way. Clearly a very close relationship. Now, of course, we've said about the timescales. The interesting thing is, if you go back to the birth of Moses, you will find in the story that it is the princess of Egypt that finds the child. Having said that, the sister, Miriam, which Mary is actually an Egyptian name, says, I can get a feeding mother for the child, and we know all that happens. And what's apparent is that timescale-wise, that falls exactly into the timescale for Hatshepsut. There's nobody else mentioned where it looks possible. And the rise of this commoner may well be Moses. So his rise in the palace, which you would expect, he's been brought up by the princess, who now is not just a princess, incidentally. Before very much longer, while he's still probably reaching his teenage years, she now becomes Pharaoh. And he's grown up alongside the person who will be the next Pharaoh. Yeah? The husband that she's married has died, her brother, and she's married again. And he starts to get all sorts of honours. And I'm not saying this is certain, but there's some serious academic work being done at the moment. And even if you look at the names of the parents in the Egyptian account, father is called Rammose, spelt exactly the same as Moses, M-O-S-E, Rammose. And of course the biblical account says, what's the name of the father? Amram. Ram-Oz. And the Hebrew version is Amram. So you can see the overlap there. They're classed as provincial peasants. And of course people had more than one name. And then this idea of did Moses actually fight in the campaign of Thutmose I out in Ethiopia? Well, actually Josephus, the historian, claims that about Moses.
We have a picture of
And
that.
nobody ever knew where that's supposed to come from.
We have a picture of his victory in Cush as well. I think,
We
don't
do
we? So
have a
that's-
picture, and so that's Samanut, but also it accounts for the victory that he was involved in Cush. So suddenly it starts to look maybe not just possible, but hey, maybe it's even likely, I don't know. So if he was in fact virtually her child, adopted child, then the idea that he is appointed to be the guardian of her child makes sense, although he's a commoner. And then, of course, even the dates coincide when Senamut vanishes, and it coincides with Moses' flight from Egypt. And what happened afterwards, in terms of striking off the images, is normal practice for when somebody is in disgrace. Hatshepsut, because she adopted him. Moses himself, because he killed the Egyptian, went away and brought the plagues to Egypt that kills the next one in the line, and Amenhotep's own son. And suddenly that looks cohesive, possible. Thank you.
We do have a picture there of Hatshepsut's mortuary complex as well. Just so you said you were sure that.
Yes, terribly sorry. I said that this is her mortuary complex. I mean, it's an incredible, vast site. It's huge, and if you look at the tomb of or what was going to be Semenut's own tomb, that's the unfinished tomb that you can still visit today.
So we do have a last slide on there where you just asked the question, is that Moses? Could well be the face of Moses there. Fascinating. And of course, thank you for that. So I think that ties in very well with the last time where we looked at the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Obviously, the Pharaoh of the Exodus would be a different Pharaoh to who was Pharaoh when Moses went to Midian, because he's there 40 years. And that's Thutmose III. We do have a picture of Thutmose III a few slides further back from there. Is this the Pharaoh that Moses grew up with? So it may well be that he was the Pharaoh while Moses was in the wilderness.
I guess what I would say is just be very careful. Don't learn your theology or archaeology or Bible history from Disney. Just
Although
because they
Disney-
bring out a movie called Prince of Egypt.
That was DreamWorks, but
Yeah, well, okay.
Having said that, in that movie they do make him the royal architect. Sorry.
Yeah. Don't get it from there.
No, don't get it from there. Don't get it from there. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Can we? Yes.
I believe you said on the last occasion that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was a Pharaoh named Amenhotep.
Yeah, Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. I do have...
Thutmose III would have been the Pharaoh of the wilderness years of Moses.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, last time I gave a sort of an account of breakdown from everything through to Akhenaten. He was the Pharaoh of the time of the invasion into Canaan, and that's he was writing, or they were writing in Canaan back to him, saying, help, give us support. But you can track all those right through to the beginning of the New Kingdom, and it all fits very, very well.
It's worth remembering that 40 years in a royal family used to be a time that a lot of things changed. It's only recently that we've had monarchs that have lasted a lot longer.
You said that Amenhotep was a 15th century BC pharaoh. I mean, you gave the dates.
I've got the dates if you want them. They're on the very first slide, actually, I think.
There is a slide with those dates on, I think, yeah.
But rather than get bogged down, I'll show you them afterwards.
It's just that in the Bible, it says that...
That's it there.
Yes, Amenhotep there. It says in the Bible, it said that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. So that puts the beginning of their sojourn in Egypt not much after 1900 BC, which in turn has the knock-on effect of putting Abraham certainly no later than 2000 BC, whereas conventionally it's been thought that he lived around 1800 BC.
Yeah, and I've got, if we ever do this again, once we start re-establishing this, I don't know if I mentioned last time, but Nineveh is incredibly important, although it's a long way from Egypt. But it's very important for establishing the key dates in the Bible. And the reason is there was an eclipse in Nineveh at the time of Jonah. And once you understand that in Nineveh they had court officials who served only for 1 year, and when they discovered in Nineveh the royal archive, what they've got is the names of every archivist, if you like, and the name of the year based on them, so we know exactly when the eclipse happened in Nineveh. Because we know that, and we know every year down to Sennacherib, and Sennacherib comes down against Hezekiah in Jerusalem, and that's recorded, and we know the exact year now because of the findings in Nineveh, so we can pin that date down. Now that we can pin that date down, you can move back through the biblical genealogies, and we know now that the dates that were first given by Bishop Ussher, who created the first chronology of all this, he was only 40 years out, and it's easy to get 40 years out when you're going over generations, because you say somebody reigned for 15 years. Do you mean 14 years and 11 months, or do you mean 15 years and 11 months? So it's easy to lose a little bit of traction on that. But we know we now can go precisely through the biblical account, because we know the date of Sennacherib at Jerusalem. We now can go right back and find the date for these things. And that's one of the helpful things that's happened to nail these figures down. And it also means, because we're now more accurate in looking at how that tallies with Egypt, we can now look to find the date of Joseph. And one of the exciting things that's come out in the last year is new possibilities of who Joseph was, including a statue that was built and defaced that may well be the statue of Joseph. So if we ever do this again, I'll probably want to explain Nineveh better and then bounce into Joseph, so you can see how that sort of now ties everything together, and the whole Hyksos story, children of Israel, and all that.
You're obviously taking the beginning of the reign of Solomon as exactly 970 BC.
I think it nudges, actually, but I haven't done the work on it yet. You've got to use Nineveh, because we know to the hour when the eclipse happened, because eclipses we can.
It's like clockwork, isn't it?
It's clockwork. You can do it to the minute, actually. So we know when that is in that royal record of what they found in Nineveh, because it has a different person every year on the same date it happens. It becomes a great clock set. So I've worked on some of it, but I haven't worked right through the whole of genealogy. I'm too busy at the moment, but it's something I will do.
So how sure are you that Solomon's reign commenced in 970 BC?
As I refer to my previous answer, I haven't done the work on it yet, but I will.
The 480 years hinges on the fourth year being 966.
It does, but it has been worked through by better people than me. to tally into the Egyptian side. Well, it's the Egyptian one's pinned down now. So that works without using Solomon. What I was doing with Solomon is use it as a general, that's where we get to. But it's the Nineveh eclipse that really helps reset everything back to Egypt.
And which year is that? Which year is the Nineveh eclipse?
It's during the 700s at the time of... it's exactly the time of Jonah. I haven't got every fact and figure to hand. I wish I had. I wish I was clever.
That's solar.
Solar, yeah, solar eclipse. Not a, yeah, no, I wouldn't use... There's too many lunar eclipses. It could be this, that, or the other. But no. If you remember, in the whole of Nineveh, the king and everybody wears sackcloth because they're so shocked at what Jonah's saying, and the eclipse happens in the middle of that. Even the horses had to wear sackcloth.
Right. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to everybody who's joined us online. Let me know if you would like to do one of these again. I don't want to just do things for the sake of it. I only want to do it if there's an appetite for it and if it's helpful. So if you do want to do another one, let me know. It will be a little while, though, because it's a lot of work. Thank you, everyone. God bless you, and good night. And just to let you know, the next thing that will happen on a Tuesday night, so we're having a few weeks off. The next Tuesday night will be a prayer meeting, and that is on the 30th of July. So we have 3 weeks off, and then it's the prayer meeting on the 30th of July. I know Sweden we're taking the whole of July off, but the month ends in the middle of the week, so you know what you're going to do. Yeah, there's still the Friday prayer meeting. There's still the Wednesday prayer meeting. Yeah. Right, okay, so once I'm back, you're going to take the Friday ones off during August. That's fine.